So today our guest speaker is going to be Brigadier General R.G.HEAD, who's going to talk on U.S. attack aviation, Air Force, and Navy light attack from 1916 to the present. But before anything else? Okay, so...
Well, I'm going to talk about my latest book. I wrote this during COVID, and with some help, I got a lot of telephone interviews. There are 53 stories in the book, and I think it's kind of a primer for docents at a museum, because there are lots of stories, anecdotal stories I got from talking to Navy and Air Force pilots, and it was just a lot of fun. So here's what we're going to talk about today. Air Force and Navy pilots are very different. They come from two completely different cultures. How many naval aviators do we have here? 1, 2, 3, several. Okay, that's good. Air Force had difficulty with the attack. I'll talk about that in the 1930s. Naval attack on Midway, of course, is a famous story. Air Force rediscovered the attack in Vietnam using A-1s, primarily B-28s. We'll talk about the Air Force about the F-16. And that's a fascinating story. And the F-16 and the F-18 are tied up together. So I'll give you a little background on that. That's me. I went to pilot training in 1960. Graduated, went to Luke, fly F-100s. The model of the F-100 was the C, and the J-57, same engine as the F-8. F-100s are a lot heavier, especially the D model, but we trained at Luke in C models. C models had no flaps. A's and C's had no flaps. 180 knots on final, plus 2 knots per 1,000 pounds of fuel. World's fastest tricycle. And I was in 2 deployments, one to Japan, Korea, and one to Turkey, pulling nuclear alert. That's what we were doing. At the same time, Navy was pulling lines on carriers. I volunteered for Vietnam. When I got there in 1965, I was one of 17,000 Americans in country. We had Vietnamese markings on the airplane. We flew with Vietnamese. We taught their pilots. Pilots that trained in the U.S. Came to Vietnam. We taught them how to dive bomb. And then on combat missions, we flew with enlisted men who at least could speak the language if we were forced down. Now, why are Air Force and Navy pilots culturally different? First of all, Air Force squadrons are twice as big. 24 squadrons, 3 squadrons in a wing, 72 airplanes, 30 or so pilots. The F-100, it was just pilots, no backseaters. Fighter or attack, the Navy was 12. The big difference was we had a squadron of 30 pilots, 1 enlisted man, no maintenance. All of our maintenance was consolidated. The Strategic Air Command was taking over the Air Force, and they had consolidated maintenance for all their bombers, and so, by golly, the fighters were going to have consolidated maintenance also. We had 72 airplanes and 56 crew chiefs. Go figure. Not a very high-end commission rate. We weren't getting very much flying time, and that's why I volunteered for Vietnam. Every squadron in the Air Force maintained constant readiness, C1. So you could only let 2 guys go on leave at a time, and the airplanes had to be kept in very good shape also. Now, several years ago, when it became apparent that the readiness accounts were not being fulfilled, no service could keep squadrons at C1 more than just a very few. And so 3 years ago, the Air Force changed and adopted the Navy system of when squadrons return from deployment, they go into essentially a C4 system. They regenerate, and they don't do much flying. And then as they get close to deployment, they have a 4-phase system, and they do basic training, intermediate training, and advanced training, red flag, other things. So it's very interesting to me to see this evolution where the Navy system of cycled readiness. Of course, the big difference was we never trained for a sea target. We did a lot of dive bombing, a lot of nuclear practice low level. Never planned on a sea target. And of course, Navy guys have led and sea targets. But the big difference is this. I love this one on the left, 10,000 feet runway. We got 2 very, very good ideas from the Navy. In fact, I would say 3. First of all, we got the fancy lights on the left-hand side that give you the approach slope indicator, 2.5 degrees or so on the glide slope. The second one was putting tail hooks on airplanes. The F-100 had no tail hook, the F-16 does. And we re-equipped all Air Force airplanes, all fighters and attack airplanes, with tail hooks. They put a spring-loaded tail hook on the F-100, so those guys flying Vietnam actually had a tail hook. And the third really good idea is the approach and barrier engagement, and that's what I caught in the A-1 when I landed. It makes it a lot easier. A lot of pilots got killed when their airplane would land, turn over, catch fire. So that was a great idea. It's pretty much beyond the imagination of any Air Force pilot for these 2 sight pictures. And seeing a ship about a mile out there and about a quarter of a mile here, rolling pitching deck, and look at this. This is calm sea and daylight. And doing that at night in a rolling pitching sea with thunderstorms, pretty much beyond our imagination. I really hand it to Navy and Marine Corps pilots. So here's a sequence that I've chosen not to tell the individual anecdotes, which are all in the book, but to kind of give you an overview of attack airplanes. Everything started in about 1916. July 1st, 1916, the Battle of the Somme started. The General Hugh Trencher massed his airplanes. Massed his airplanes to support the Army, and the Army needed it. They had 30,000 casualties the first hour and 60,000 the first day. And they made about 2 or 3 miles, which the Germans took back the following day. Billy Mitchell did the same thing in 1818, the 2 big battles that the Americans had. He massed over 1,200 aircraft, mostly in a ground support role and some escorts. So everything could fly, even the scouts and pursuit airplanes that just had machine guns, rolled in. And they learned some lessons from that, which we all know. One is high loss rates, and secondly, the need for armor on ground attack, because you're so close to the enemy. Here in the 1920s, both the Navy and the Air Force faced cultural problems. The first combat action for the Navy and for any Navy in World War I was, first of all, the Japanese attacked the German colony at Tianjin. People don't realize that Japan was going to get into the fight very early. And a Navy scout airplane saw the German part of the German fleet and reported it back. So the battleship admirals who controlled the Navy immediately got the idea that airplanes can see a lot farther than from 50 feet up in the top part of a battleship. And so observation and scouting was a mission that they saw. They did not see the need for bombs or guns on an airplane, and didn't see the need for massed airplanes. The big debate over aircraft carriers, between aircraft carriers and battleship, was how many airplanes do you need? The Royal Air Force Flying Corps solved the problem first. If you're going to attack another fleet, you need lots and lots of airplanes. So the 1 or 2 scout airplanes on cruisers and battleships would not be the answer. You had to have an aircraft carrier that could carry multiple dozens of aircraft. Now the big part, Navy had junior people mostly who were flying aviators in the 20s. As far as scout, are they a part of the line? Is a separate strike force? And is it going to be war at sea or land attack? There was not much war at sea until the big battle in the North Sea, where the British more or less defeated the German battleships. From day one, the Army Air Corps, Army Air Service, originating in the Signal Corps, had a debate. General Spatz said it best. The Army walked on the ground and we flew through the air. It was as different as that, as simple as that. And so one of the very first laws passed in the 1920s was that you had to be an aviator to command aviators. And that was a big change over the Army because they had, in the Signal Corps, the ranking person had the authority. But there was serious debate about should the Army Air Corps, and later the Army Air Forces in the 1940s, should they support the ground forces in interdiction, or should they do strategic bombing? Trenchard initiated strategic bombing in World War I, but it wasn't very deep. It was just beyond the edge of interdiction. But the Air Force saw that only the strategic mission would lead to a separate Air Force. And this is a story best told in Barry Smith's book, The Air Force Plans for Peace. So, and I'll get to 1935 when the big change occurred. Dive bombing, 1925. The squadron commander of VF-2 fighter, flying a Curtis bomb, virtually invented high-angle dive bombing, 60 to 65 degrees. They had been doing 30 or 45-degree bombing, but they found that 60 degrees was so much more accurate. And it is. I mean, just the law of physics. The steeper you get, the less the 12 or 6 o'clock error. You still can't handle, you have to handle wind, but steep dive bombing is very, very accurate. And so from 1926 to 1945, that was the best tactic involved. And he solved the problem and demonstrated in the end-of-fleet problem of 1926. And that's another thing I'll hand to the Navy. The Air Force never had anything comparable to the fleet problem. We never went for big exercises until Red Flag was developed in the late 70s. We put together some exercises in the 1960s under McNamara, but there were nothing comparable to Red Flag or Blue Flag that we did later. So here's what we see. Both the Navy and the Air Force started with the de Havilland DH-4. And 1918, and most of the aircraft that the Air Corps flew in the 1920s were the de Havilland, and the Navy had the same. It was a twin-engine, very big engine airplane, and was used for reconnaissance, bombing, interdiction, strategic bombing, good, solid airplane of its time. And of course, in the 1920s, USS Langley occurred, and you can tell your visitors it was based right here at North Island, built on the East Coast, but sailed through the Panama Canal and came up and was based at North Island for 3 or 4 years. Had some very famous exercises, fleet problems, again, in the 1920s. Here's a shot of the Martin T4, M for Martin, landing on the Saratoga, carrier number 3. Here's another Martin. See how Martin kind of dominating the Navy acquisition in the 1920s. Until the late 1930s, when Douglas comes in and look, Douglas Dauntless, AD, Skyhawk. Douglas is really the premier airplane builder and designer, Ed Heinemann, and there's a lot about Ed Heinemann design techniques in the book, because there are so many fascinating stories that he developed. And of course, that was the hero of the Battle of Midway. In the 1960s, the Air Force and the Army were in a heavy debate about close air support, and I'll say a little more about that later. That resulted in the A-7 in the Air Force, the Navy, and then followed by the F-16, the Hornet, and the Super Hornet. Midway. Midway is a fascinating story. There were 29 ensigns on the Enterprise for the Battle of Midway. And there's a long story from Admiral Hopkins when he retired. He gave a verbal interview on tape, and it's now written up. You probably have it in the library, but we tell a lot of that story. He took off, of course, you know, the Battle of Midway. He was under one of the great leaders of the attack squadron, VB-6, V-bombing 6 on the Enterprise. They flew out way past the point of no return. Finally saw that one group of the two groups that saw the enemy fleet. They saw a destroyer hightailing it back for what they thought was a fleet, found the fleet, rolled in. It's a good shot of what we probably looked at. He's probably about a 70-degree dive there. But he gets attacked by a Zero just before he drops his bomb, evades the Zero, drops his bomb, and then heads for the water. He's flying about 50 feet over the water back to the Enterprise. Another ensign joins up on left wing, another one on the right wing. 40 miles out, one of the ensigns' engines runs out of fuel, drops in the water. Hopkins noted his location. He was picked up. Within sight of the carrier, the other ensign's fuel ran out. He goes in the water. And when Hopkins made it back to the carrier, he was one of 5 airplanes in the attack field that made it back. Amazing, amazing, amazing story. And here, of course, is the result. You can see the Japanese lost 320 airplanes. We lost 150. Nobody talks very much about those 150. Most of them ran out of gas. And so, of these casualties, the Japanese lost 3,000, we lost 317. A lot of those were pilots who ran out of gas and were not picked up. Submarines picked up some, surface ships picked up others, but we lost quite a few. 1935.
The microphone keeps cutting out.
I don't know why. Maybe it's rotational. Hold your hand up. I can't quite tell, so hold your hand up if it's not, walk a little closer. 1935, Boeing produced the B-17. This is the early version, tail gun, blisters like the Catalina, with guns in the side, only a small gun in the nose. And remember, all the generals in the 1930s had started out, most of them started out as fighter pilots, converted to bomber pilots, and when they saw the bomber was going to be the reason to get a separate Air Force, they began to dominate the Air Force decision. The attack airplanes, and there are great pictures in the book, by the way, of the attack airplanes. The problem with aircraft in the 1930s for both the Air Force and Navy was that the engine development was not progressing as fast as the aircraft development was. And so you had fairly streamlined airplanes some with fixed landing gear and some not. But the engines weren't big enough to make them go very fast. They get to 500 or 600 horsepower, and that was about it. It wasn't until the 1940s that the really big engines, and that's where you get the Corsair, the Hellcat, all the aircraft that we think about in World War II. So I said the attack airplanes did not do very well in a bombing competition in Hawaii. And so the Air Force got the idea that if the major weapon for attack airplanes was going to be bombs, why not use airplanes that are built to carry bombs, carry more? Also, one thing, the Air Corps Tactical School observer in the Hawaiian Islands exercise said the pilots are not very accurate on strafing at such high speed. Right, 200 knots. However, they were wrong on that. As any jet pilot knows, you can be very, very accurate in strafing and has nothing to do with speed, or very little to do with speed. So, General Hap Arnold, who was the chief general in the Air Force, said, under present conditions, there is no such thing as attack aviation. And so we get the result of, come over here, they have a bombing competition, bomber competition in 1939, and from that we get the Douglas A-20, the North American B-25, the B-26, and then later the A-26, which was both A and B versions, the Invader. So these airplanes dominated World War II. There were a few A-36s, the first version of the P-51 that was paid for by Great Britain, and they served mainly in North Africa. They had good bombing and steep, by the way, very steep dive bombing. There's a story about that in the book. Slide. Okay, well, Air Force pilots, if they're fighter pilots, they're fight or attack. No Air Force pilot except an A-10 would admit to being an attack pilot. But in the Navy, right after pilot training, you get this diversion into fighter and attack until recently that dominated the Navy cultural system. So I'm glad to see you've got a P-51 Mustang here. Here's a P-51, F-16, F-15, and those really dominate the Air Force for the next several years. And that's the slide that I just talked about. Now, in the 1960s, General Maxwell Taylor, the Chief Staff of the Army, became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he launched an attack on the Air Force because during the Korean War, the Army had maintained that the Air Force never really gave good close air support. Wasn't timely, didn't have the right airplanes, didn't carry enough armament, and of course they were flying the B-51s that they were given the attack role from World War II, and of course as a ground attack airplane, that's not the one you would choose. They lost a lot of airplanes who got hit, got a bullet in the hydraulic and the cooling system, and engine would quit. So the Army said, we need better close air support, and if you don't give it to us, we're going to build our own little attack force. And they followed that threat with technology, and we're building the AH-56 armed helicopter, a 200-knot rigid rotor helicopter. So the threat was real. And OSD, the Office of Secretary of Defense, had been trying to get the Air Force to buy the A-4, which actually would have been a darn good airplane for Vietnam, as the Navy found out, and the Navy, tremendous expertise in the ground attack role. But the Air Force didn't want another Navy airplane. They just bought the F-4, and we were getting F-4 into the fleet. Of course, the F-4 was fast, through air to ground. So we had a competition. The F-5 was like the squishy Tiger airplane, sweetie. And with this bomb load, the radius of action was about 75 miles. And I don't think Vietnamese ever bought it because it became painfully obvious. It just didn't carry very much fuel. But the supersonic Air Force generals wanted the F-5. And there were two studies. The F-5 came out on top. The first one was decent, wrong answer, go back and do it again. And so they went to a much more complicated. The A-7 had just flown. The A-7 was going to replace the A-4. And 1965 had just flown. So finally, after a huge computer study, which is quoted in the book and is the subject of my dissertation in more detail, there were 3 or 4 answers. First of all, we'll buy the A-7, 3 wings. 2, we're going to put a gun in the F-4 to make the D model go to the E. And because we're going to have some air-to-ground airplanes with the A-7, we need an air superiority fighter, and that was going to be the F-15, and that was the airplane the Air Force really wanted. So everything after that, for the next 10 years, was dominated by the Air Force priorities to get the F-15 operational. The Secretary of Defense approved the Air Force buy the A-7. He denied the gun in the F-4 and delayed the development of the F-15. It took him another 2 years to get a gun in the F-4. That's the E model that I flew later in the last part of my career. So we get two airplanes. The Navy A-7A, A's and B's and E's, 535 aircraft. Lots of squadrons. I don't know how many, just dozens of squadrons. And the Air Force gets 3 wings. That's the Myrtle Beach tailboat. And the A-7s that deployed to Korat from Myrtle Beach took over the Sandy mission of the A-1s in 1972, just before Linebacker 2. So, now Vaught did not understand what had just happened because he had a Navy project manager, an Air Force deputy who was a 1-star. Actually, he was a colonel at the time. He was a colonel, and then a Navy captain who was a Navy deputy. Well, these 2 guys, Bob Hales and Bob Doss, called the Bobsey twins, got along together, and Bob Doss is a legend in the Navy. He had been in VX-6 at China Lake. He had an A-4, he was the A-4 squadron commander. His A-4s, he demanded all the avionics be top-notch, so doing the nuclear deliveries and everything was right up to shape. A lot of A-4 squadrons didn't put that much emphasis on the avionics. And so the Navy and A and B did not have advanced avionics. Well, the big first problem was A and B were underpowered. The Navy didn't really think it had a problem because with the catapult launch, it's not such a big factor, even heavily loaded, although they had forgotten to test, or didn't test until later, the steam ingestion that the A's and B's had, which reduced the load they could take off. Turned out that they couldn't carry much more than the A-4 on the A and B version. So the first thing the Air Force wanted to do was to get a new engine in there, and Pratt & Whitney was slow rolling the Navy on making a better engine, but they were selling TF-30s. Of course, TF-30 for the F-111, TF-30 for the F-14, I think. Yeah, same TF-30. So we got a new engine. Rotary cannon. The Air Force in 1954 had consolidated and replaced all of its multiple cannon with the rotary cannon. Hey, Jim, welcome aboard. Here's an A-7 guy. Jim wanted to give some of your lectures on he flew the E model. And I'll get to the avionics shortly. Jim's given me a lot of tips on the A-7E. So the Air Force and Navy could not resolve the issue on the guns. You had 2 slide cannons or 4 slide cannons in the A-7As and Bs, went all the way to Secretary of Defense, and McNamara directed the Navy to put the rotary cannon in the A-7E. And so they did, and with the change, Bob Ross told me, with the change in the fuselage, that you needed to make with a new engine, the rotary cannon, that was the time to make the avionics change. And so he and Bob Hales got together, went around, and it's a marvelous story of politicking within a professional organization. And I've got a little model that one of the professors developed. You get consensus among your colleagues at your level, your rank level, and when you get that consolidated, then you start to go vertical. And you don't argue in terms of a new mission or a new strategy. That's too much for people to change. You're just improving something that has been tried and true mission in the service today. So ground attack was still there, but the change from analog to digital computers made all the difference in the world. It accounted for wind, and I'll show you and it gave you this. It gave you a heads-up display. It heads out of the instrument panel. The instruments, there are 14 pieces of data that were displayed on the A7E and D windscreen, and the next variation of it goes into the FA-18 and the F-35. So this was 1968. This system was.
What's the .7 accuracy?
Bombing accuracy, like artillery accuracy, is the measure of unit is mils. A mil is 1 foot at a distance of 1,000 feet. And the reason that's useful is that it multiplies easily. If you're at 10,000 feet, when you release the bomb, at whatever the dive angle you're at, a 10 mil accuracy will give you a 100-foot bomb. I mean, it's programmed to give you a 100-foot bomb. The A7As and Bs, and I would say the F4 was not as good, not a good bomber, because it wasn't stable in going so fast. The A7As and Bs probably had about 18 mil accuracy. And for some places in North Vietnam, that was enough, but for hitting a specific target and bridges, I mean, forget it. Anybody knows about dive bombing bridges, there's no way a conventional dive bomber was going to destroy a bridge. So what they argued for, they went around the country talking to all the avionics manufacturers, and they came up with a study and said, we can probably give you 8 mils accuracy. Now, 8 mils rather than 18 mils is a huge, increase in accuracy. And so all the debate about the avionics was how many mils would it give you. And when they, after they decided to put the digital computers in the airplane, which gave you all the other information, then the debate was what kind of mil accuracy is the manufacturer going to give you. And here there was a big difference, because the Navy had, LTV had been used to giving the Navy their best product. We'll do as good as we can. They did not want to guarantee 10 mils accuracy. And they maintained that the Air Force and Navy project managers insisted on them contracting for the best accuracy that the study had come out with. So we have a 10 mil system. Now, you can tell your visitors the accuracy of the A7 has been unparalleled. Both Navy and Air Force nuggets have been able to bomb as good as professional guys with 18 years service. And there's some quotes from squadron commanders in that. And Air Force captain took out 4 airplanes, 6 bombs each, and a dispenser, 24 bullseyes. 24 bullseyes, unheard of before. And so that was what the Air Force wanted. If you're going to dive bomb the So the study came up with 7 million, and part of that was due to the HUD. And an unexpected benefit from the A7 pouch, one of the admirals told me, was you could put the flight path marker on the lip of the carrier, and it would give you perfect glide slope and attitude information, made landing a lot easier, especially at night. So, good question. Thank you very much. Now, the Air Force never really liked the A7. It was really forced on them by McNamara and the systems analysis guys. For example, the Air Force said, okay, we'll take 3 squadrons of 3 wings of A7s, and McNamara said, okay, you like that, take 5. Take 5 wings. So there was a blurb in the production schedule where the approval was for 5 wings. It never got to 5 wings. They ended up with 3, but that was after McNamara left office. So that was the example of what happened. So the Chief of Staff, General McConnell, whom I interviewed when I was a major, never liked the A7, and he wanted, the Air Force is going to do dive bombing. It needs an airplane really built for close air support. Now, one of the lessons of World War I, I told you, was that ground attack airplanes are going to need armor. Who put armor in an airplane in the 1930s and 1940s? Only Ed Heinemann. The project manager for the A1 in 1950 was a lieutenant commander who had World War II experience, and he knew the benefit of armor plate on attack airplanes. And he saw a lot of losses in Korea due to ground fire. And he had Douglas do a study, and they pointed out all the places in the airplane that were taking ground fire that really debilitated the airplane. So he said, okay, we need armor plate. So he had a friend who was in the Office of Defense Production in the Korean War, and he said, I need tons and tons of armor plate. The guy said, well, let me work on it and see what we can get. 3 weeks later, he gets, the Navy commander, gets a phone call from a vice president at Douglas and says, hey, I've got 3 boxcars out here of steel. He said, what should I do with them? And the commander says, make armor plate. And when I flew in Vietnam, the E model, we had half-inch thick armor plate all the way from the engine back behind the cockpit, underneath the engine, underneath the fuel tank, and it was a flying armored machine. And it only cut the airspeed by 1 knot. So it was a good trade-off. Of course, there's another story about how Ed Heinemann made the airplane so rugged, and that's another innovation in the development process. So there are a lot of stories in the development process of how we got these airplanes that would be useful to you. So we wanted the A-10. Now, the fighter mafia. Did you know that the Navy had a fighter mafia also? It was guys in the 1970s who believed that the higher, faster, farther, F-14 and F-15 were not the way to go. You did not need twin engines, and you did not need to go Mach 2.4, because even the air fights don't occur that fast. 1.4 is about all you need. And I've had the F4 at 1.4, and it turns like a puppy at that airspeed. So they helped design. There were 3 guys. John Boyd, you'll see later, was the head of the fighter mafia, and they were going to overturn. Of course, this was the late 60s. You know, opposition to the war in Vietnam. There was the feeling in the country that everything we're doing, you know, in government is wrong. It's just bad, wrong. It's costing money. It's not effective. We were not doing well in Vietnam. Of course, we weren't allowed to do well, but that was the problem. So they designed the A-10 around the gun, and there were a few stories about the designer of the gun is a maverick and kind of a weird guy. But he was the developer. The gun had a separate development. And by the way, the A-10 SPO, System Project Office, started in the F-15 project office at Wright-Patterson. They got dovetailed in and then separated out later. So they finally produced the airplane. In 1976, they're operational. The wing and England at Bentwaters flew 513 sorties in one day with 72 airplanes. That's about 6, 7 sorties a day, hot refueling, all going to the gunnery range, fully combat training missions. Wonderful airplane. Desert Storm, they killed 997 tanks and 726 artillery. And artillery is hard to kill. You got to hit the tube really to knock it out. And now today it's being phased out. But every A-10 pilot has memorized the phrase from General Horner. General Horner's son graduated from pilot training and went to become an A-10 pilot. And General Horner told people, said, I think my son has a brain injury. He's no longer a fighter pilot. He's flying A-10s. Well, about the 5th day into the war, when the A-10s were doing so well, General Horner's at the afternoon debriefing, and he's going around to each element, talking about what they did. And he says, okay, now we get to the A-10, he said, I take back all the bad things I said about the A-10. They're saving our asses. And I love them. That was fantastic. And I say every A-10 pilot can repeat that story. Yes.
So what's taking its place, and is it as good as the A-10?
No way. We're phasing it out. They're down to one wing, and they're phasing it out a squadron at a time. And they're going to finish. Congress made the Air Force promise to keep them until 2030. We're not going to make it until 2030. And the big argument is they're no use in a China war. Everything in the Pentagon now is focused on a war with China. And so the Navy's going crazy trying to figure out how to fight that, how to win. Question?
All we got to do is say, look what happened in Korea when they were fighting the Chinese.
Yeah.
Close air support to take the gun on the Chinese.
Okay.
Repeat the question, please.
I think it needs to stay.
Well, you said if they have to remember the war in Korea, close air support really kicked the butt of the Chinese, but I think they think that it wouldn't survive. The contest is going to be so complicated and so high technology that you're going to lose a lot of air. Anyway, the word is they won't survive in a China war. So we're on the way up. Now, let's go back a little bit, and I hope I'm not getting too long. The fighter mafia really wanted to design a better airplane than the F-15. They didn't need 2 engines, they didn't need Mach 2.4 or 2.5, and the F-15 was going to be only for air superiority. It wouldn't have an air-to-ground roll. So, and it was heavy, very heavy, 60,000 pounds. Remember, they came right after the F-111, same engines. So the F-15 was originally designed with a swing wing, even a swing wing like the F-14. And you have all that heavy, all that weight. Well, these two guys really got together, and this is the fighter. John Boyd was a fighter weapons school instructor. He was known as 60-second Boyd because he would let guys get behind him, and in 60 seconds he would reverse and be on your table. He had 2 master's degrees, went to Georgia Tech, and he had an idea that we could build a 20,000-pound airplane called the Redbird, and there were 3 miracles that happened that developed the F-16 and later the F-18. First of all, Mike Lowe, one of my classmates, was a major in the requirements office in the Air Staff, and the head of the office got a $149,000 grant, And he said, we'll let that out. So they put the RFP out to industry for $149,000, and they let industry bid on it. The industry sent their top engineers for conferences at the Pentagon in a motel near the Pentagon at nights and weekends because they were deathly afraid that somebody would find out they were developing an alternative to the F-15 and they'd kill the program. So the first miracle was that was such a small contract. Now, why would a manufacturing company send its best engineers to work on a $90,000 contract? Because they know there's a $1 billion contract behind it for the winner of this competition. And so with BUAB, you got a 50-50 chance of winning. So the result was, the second miracle was that the McNamara administration got voted out of office. Johnson came in, and then Laird became Secretary of Defense. And Laird's deputy, Packard, from Hewlett-Packard, set aside, I think it was $2 million for prototyping. Now, the Air Force was already a leap ahead. They had been designing this Redbird, this wonderful air-to-air airplane, with a $149,000 contract, and so that was going to be one of their prototypes. And the cargo airplane for the C-17 was the second one. The Air Force won both of the prototype contests, and they had enough money to fund the YF-16 and the YF-17. So the second miracle was Packard putting this money aside to have an internal competition of actually flying airplanes instead of designing them only with computers. And so the fly-off competition was very close, very, very close. The F-16 won. It was a little better in performing the air-to-ground role, but they were both good to fly. The Cobra divided by Northrop is a little different and did not develop directly into the F-18, but I'll get to that. So, and the Mike Lowe, the major, in the requirement shop, he had to come back to work in Nang, but he got a fellowship to go to MIT, and he wrote his master's thesis on fly-by-wire control systems for aircraft, and was assigned right back in the requirement shop, implementing the very thing he had written his master's thesis about. Amazing. And so the F-16 was lighter because it saved the weight of all the hydraulics in the airplane, except for the landing gear. And the third miracle was, he said, okay, now we've got the winner of the prototype competition, what are we going to do with it? At the same time, the Air Force was bargaining with the Secretary of Defense to increase the number of Air Force wings. And so the Secretary of Defense said, if you buy the F-16, we'll give you 6 more wings in the total fighter force structure. And at the same time, the NATO chipped in and said, we need to replace all the F-104s that are in Europe, standing nuclear alert, and they're getting old, and so we will chip in. And so if the United States buys the F-16, we will buy it for our NATO countries. They ended up, I think 39 countries bought the F-16. That was the third miracle. Now, the F-16, back a little bit. The F-18 follows the F-16 by about 3 years. And in that 3 years, they interviewed a lot of A-7 pilots, Jim, at Northrop. The Navy was suspicious of Northrop because they had been an Air Force company. So it made them team with McDonnell Douglas, an old Navy contractor. And in that 3 years, McDonnell Douglas called in the A-7 pilots and interviewed them and said, what do you need in terms of avionics? And so they took the A-7 avionics system, upgraded it, and in that 3 years, they got a better avionics system than the F-16 had. And so it's kind of ironic now that air-to-air, the guys, pilots who have flown both, say they like the F-18 better because it's got an integrated cockpit. And for air-to-ground, they like the F-16 better. I don't know about the avionics, but they were both improved. So now at this point, the Navy had been flying F-14s for air-to-air, even though they later put bombs on them, and A-7s for air-to-surface, air-to-ground. And with the F-18, they were originally going to have an F-18A and an F-18B, but the avionics and the cockpit had improved so much, and they were able to put so many knobs and dials on the throttles that they were able to combine the air-to-air and air-to-ground features of the avionics system. And so the Navy, after 40 years of having two separate cultures, now combine them, and F-18, FA is both air-to-air and air-to-ground. So it's no surprise that the Air Force long wanting a multi-purpose airplane, and now the Navy convinced of a multi-purpose airplane. Everybody is loving the F-35 if they can only get it into production, and but there's a talk that the F-35 is so complicated that it's slowed down the effort. And of course, the software changes have been just numerous. And well, again, operational 2015. It's hard to imagine. It's been operational for 8 years. There's still not very many wings. I think the Marine wing was the first one to be operational. The Air Force plans to buy 2,400. Israel's going to buy them. Australia's going to buy them. They're going to be they're going to have a lot of F-35s. But Boeing never, who bought McDonnell Douglas after the disastrous A-12 problem, Boeing was smart enough to say, Navy, you're not getting very many F-35s originally. We'll be glad to produce some more F-18s for you to fill the gap. And so they've extended their production, I think, 2 or 3 times now. So the F-18s are still the main aircraft on deploying carriers. Well, that's about it. We've talked about 2 cultures. They began with specialized airplanes. Both remained specialized for 40 years. 1960 is a big introduction of digital avionics that affected everything up to the F-35. And with the exception of the A-10, the Air Force has done multi-purpose overwhelmingly. And with advanced technology, now the Navy's multi-purpose. So diverging, are now together in their training programs. Question? Yes, sir.
It goes back to pre-World War II. Mitchell or what have pre-World War II Navy torpedo bomber versus dive bomber. Didn't the Navy realize the vulnerability of a torpedo bomber, obviously taking you right up to Midway, and the excessive losses of the torpedo bomber, and why they didn't make the adjustment earlier, if you will, to go to the dive bomber?
Good question is, when did the Navy give up on having torpedo bombers only? I think it's part of Navy culture. After World War I, the dominant Navy thought was that torpedoes would be the better weapon. Larger, heavier warhead, able to deliver it, much more accurately than dive bombers. But the problem was, of course, Midway, the torpedo bombers got blown away and did not make very much of an impact. But the change didn't occur in 1942, because in 1945, when Douglas built AD, it was a dive torpedo bomber. The AD disguised the fact the attack included both torpedo and dive bombing. But Korea, there was certainly no use for torpedoes, and eventually the bomb carrying capability became dominant. Good question. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. Again, I've really enjoyed being here. Carol and I did. I brought some books along. I would recommend it. It's a great book for a volunteer, for a ghost and guide. I'll be glad to endorse any of them that you would like. Thank you very much. Thank you.